We're here with architect Preston Scott Cohen. Scott, it's a great honor to have you here with us today. A large part of your work and research deals with geometrical processes like projections, transformations, and distortions. Could you elaborate more on those concepts and their importance in contemporary architectural production and discussion?
Well, it's a very interesting question because probably the perception is very much that they are related to computation. But actually the computer is only used as a tool, an instrument to achieve these things. But I think the main ambition is to have the unusual proportionality, the unusual shape correspond to different things. For example, to correspond to the way people move through space, to encourage certain kind of experience of movement through space. And obviously perception, to have the viewer perceive the building in perspective in ways which are unexpected, so that one is drawn to experience, to explore the building, for example, with a different understanding of the depth of the space. So this is what happens to a great extent in the Tel Aviv Museum and some other projects like the New York Canopy, where the perspective is extended or where the space is made to appear less deep than it really is. And one has to go further than one expects to understand all of it and to perceive it, to see that there's more than what one had expected, because the perspective is even deeper than one thought. Sometimes it accelerates your sense of the space, and sometimes it slows down that space. So to change the temporality of space is very important to me, because it helps the subject to engage in the sense of being in this place, and it makes it memorable and specific, unlike other spaces that lack that, or that are against which this is measured, that is the normal space. Distortion is an abnormality, and that difference is what makes people have a different experience.
What about the tension and relation between a dynamic formal process and the final permanent and static construction?
Well, I think the static for me is finally the place where everything resides, the final built form. So, for example, though you see these progressions or though you see convergence, these things which evoke change in space, when you see something getting smaller or something converging, you feel the dynamic as something implied by that. But it finally is fixed in real space, so that this is part of an enduring experience. I'm not so interested in the dynamism of the design, except that it should allow me to explore the different effects of these proportions, to measure them and to test them myself, to determine what is the best possible solution. They also allow me to be flexible with construction, with the other engineers, with the consultants, all the factors that are determining the architecture. Those things can be drawn into it very dynamically. So that for the design process, which is something not seen later, it is important to arrive to the best solution. But this is not what is expressed. What is expressed is something for the observer and for in the actuality of the site and the way light hits the building and all of those things that are, as I said, enduring. That's what I'm really interested in. That's the goal for all of this. Yeah.
In one of your recent writings, Dexterous Architecture, you make an interesting reference of a performer and architecture. I found that reference especially interesting because your buildings seem to interact with users in a very particular way. Architectural form produces gestures, in my take of it. As you mentioned in your lecture, they either hug the landscape or offer shelter, or they become characters that interact with users and index them on how they should or could navigate the space, as you already have mentioned. But how do you define those gestures? How do they become these or this universal language that a user can understand and relate to?
That's so interesting because there is an image involved. I mean, I think when you look at a building, and this is something, it wouldn't be easy to give you a systematic answer, but I think we can recognize, because of certain normal things about buildings that we come to expect, when the building begins to suggest a gesture. So for example, if a building is normally rather quiet about distributing things very rationally, and suddenly there's some subtle deviation from that, it could indicate something unusual happening behind or within. This is one of the things, but at a certain point it even starts to imply that there's tension within the object, that there's some kind of, an expression has to do with some kind of reaction. I mean, I think if the building itself exhibits tension, that is, let's say that we perceive a kind of imbalance, or we perceive, for example, compression, something that appears compressed or stretched. We empathize with those things bodily and in our imagination. We begin to believe that the building has in it some of the characteristics that we imagine living creatures to have. I mean, I think we identify with buildings altogether because buildings, in fact, are a manifestation of ourselves designing for ourselves a second skin, a second body. I mean, whether it's a very large one for many and more than one of us, or just one of us. But the house is just more obviously personal. But I still think there's something about the idea of making a nest or a shelter. You know, this kind of primitive reality that that's what a building is somehow there. And then you could say that when you see something stretched and compressed, this is another thing, or distorted, you recognize, because this is something that, you know, as I said, a human being might succumb to in making an expression. It's not the repose of a normal expression, but some expression of something particular, something specific. So to give it specificity is to see it relating to the norm and now being exceptional, just as we see a certain kind of facial expression as the exception to the norm of your facial expression. If you were to express something with some extraordinary, you know, enthusiasm, or you express a reaction to something very funny, your face is not in its normal repose. It's peculiar that a building should hold such an expression all the time. Think about it, we don't. Why should a building? But there are other reasons it could hold this expression. It just have to do with the need for the windows to be there that way, or just has to do with how narrow it is, and some matter-of-fact thing. So only if you look at it a certain way or know other buildings relative to it, that you might see that it's somehow expressing something. It's kind of an interesting thing. It has a lot to do with how we look at things and when we see them and in what context, how familiar we are with them. When you're unfamiliar with a building, it might seem more expressive than when it is familiar. When it's familiar, it has other qualities that dominate your life. The way it moves light, the way it feels comfortable, you know, it helps people, you know, to support certain activities and things like this. A building on a daily level is not the same as a building we see less and less frequently.
But it also might be related to the idea of losing balance, yes, or playing with gravity.
Yeah.
And for example, again with the reference of a performer, for example a dancer, they are trying to break the balance and then find it again in a certain position. So these formal expressions of a building are in that sense related to these other expressions in art. And yes, you don't get tired of those gestures, and somehow you understand them. So do you relate to other art forms when you look for, you do?
Oh, definitely. I definitely find myself moved by the other arts and recognize how they move me. Try to emulate that. I think there is a way to emulate that. You don't think of architecture that way, but it has its own expression. There's no question about it. So, you know, particularly when you think of painting, you think of, I showed Pollock and I showed Rector today, and I think the attitude about depth and color is very connected to the way I'm thinking right now.
As one of your students in design studio at Harvard, we were asked to deal with the idea of occupying and transforming an existing building through the presence of another architectural construct inside of this building. How do you describe the relation between interior interior and exterior spatial geometry. Are they separate in your mind, or are they part of a larger continuity?
Well, I have said that there are circumstances and many, I mean, very commonly that demand that we conceive of the envelope to some degree independently of the inside. This is troubling to me. I mean, I like to think from the inside out. But it happens that we have very standard conceptions of the frame of buildings, the distribution, organization of space, that is something that's more determined by urban circumstances. For example, the distribution of the cores and the position of the building among other buildings and the connection to parking below ground or anything like this, and the fact that all the spaces should have certain heights that to do with the programs. It's not something only that we can discern, not something we can so easily decide in certain cases, I mean, with very standard buildings, but with very exceptional buildings, cultural facilities and such, which I work on, of course something else is possible, much more integrated between the inside and the outside. It's much more likely that you could achieve that. Even there, though, I have to tell you, it's not always so easy. Having to do with the way architecture and landscape architecture and interior architecture are independently developed today. The trades have taken independent paths in the process, and the management of design is something, unfortunately, now in the control of project managers and so forth. This is a troubling reality, but it comes also out of the facts of construction, the framing and the, as I said, the technology with the elevator and so forth. It's sort of predisposed this to happen, that the envelope is separate. But anyway, leaving that aside, it's kind of a dual shell. I mean, I treated the lightfall as kind of an outside-in phenomenon. Imagine the envelope of the building, which is a shell that contains, it's kind of the skin of the whole entity of the whole body of the building. Now there's another shell, a second skin, but this time with a void inside of it. There is no interior filling that. That could almost be a facade, but it's seen from the inside. In a way, it's a body turned inside out, or outside in, I'm sorry, outside in. Definitely outside in. And what's interesting about that is normally when we look at the outside of a building, we can understand the whole building as an object or a volume, whatever it may be. We can see the whole in our mind's eye, or even if we're only looking from one side, we know that it's possible to see it as a whole. We know that it's an object. I mean, if it's open and free around it, it's an object, let's say. But on the inside of buildings, we're not capable of seeing things as whole things. I mean, always, not only is it a fragmentary view that we obtain from the inside, but there are no objects on the inside. There's a kind of constant state of in-betweenness. Yes, rooms are self-complete sometimes, but even those are partitioned from something else. They're not actually autonomous entities. They are usually a fragment of a larger plan. And even when they are whole, we don't see them as an object. It would be rare that you would think an experience of a room inside of a building as an object, because we're inside of that thing, that room. But in the case of the lightfall, because we never inhabit it, because it does not correspond to any particular typology of room, but that it's so coherent, so self-contained, so excessively, extremely, I should say, obviously coherent and self-contained because of the opposing symmetries and because of the consistency of its development as it spirals up. It is something like the outside of a building in our mind. It has the same characteristics, that is wholeness, completeness, comprehensibility, exteriority. That exteriority meaning something that you can, that is comprehensible that way mentally. So it has the characteristics of the exterior, though it is utterly and entirely inside. So to make an interior behave that way, to make it cohere the way an exterior does, is to double the skin, to make us all the more aware of the body of the building as a body. I think it's very interesting to inhabit that condition in a different way. And the doubling was absolutely essential, because normally we don't double the outside on the inside, we do something else on the inside. The inside of a television museum between the two shells is more conventional. I mean, and that is normal interiority. It's a series of rooms, galleries, but always the return to this doubled skin, that shapes your whole understanding of the museum. And that's unusual, to have a double skin.
Very interesting. What is the importance of academic experimentation in a country like Guatemala?
Well, I was observing here the topographic conditions, in particular this campus, the way it introduces some very unexpected experiences that I regard to be essential in architecture, such as the way in which the roof of the building is unexpectedly understood that way. I mean, when I arrived to the campus, I was on the ground and I was walking from the pavement and I walked upon the roof and hadn't known that I was on a roof, and all of a sudden recognized that I was. That seamless ambiguity between landscape and building is very unusual. I think the potential to develop an architecture of that kind of seamless continuity between landscape and architecture is very, very distinct, having to do with the topography and the culture of this place, the desire for that connection. I think today many people are interested in integrating landscape and architecture. It seems that given the climate, given the microclimates of this country, this place could be a kind of laboratory of many different kinds of climatic conditions, and that the topography, the kind of extreme topography, is what will make the experience, heighten our understanding of the reaction of these microclimates. Of architecture's response to these microclimates. Architecture responds to the way it is and shelters us in different ways under different conditions environmentally. Those different kinds of sheltering conditions, when the topography is in play, when the topography is asking us to be inventive, means a very heightened condition of a heightened kind of experimental, well, let's say, a heightened inventiveness. I mean, a heightened awareness of the possibilities of being inventive. To find solution to the topography, the sequencing of space has to be reconsidered. The way the building engages the ground is altogether changed by the topography. And then with different climates, you could have a diverse series of languages. You could be the country that finds, in a way, many different kinds of languages for architecture, all in a very concentrated area because of this microclimatic condition you have here and the topography. I mean, it's an incredible combination of circumstances, given the culture of the place, which seems to me is open and inquiring, and it has the spirit to be very inventive. So I think there's something very unique about this place. I'm very excited about it.
Well, thank you. Scott, just one more question.
Yeah.
You have taught and lectured in top architecture schools all over the world. What is your take on architectural education? Where do you think it's headed?
Well, I mean, right now there is a tendency to emphasize urbanism, landscape, and on the one hand. On the other, I think we have now environmentalism, environmental technology as a source for thinking. And there's the ongoing interest in computation. I am concerned that the fundamental questions of spatiality, tectonics, the things I'm talking about, the perception and habitation of space, are not being addressed. I think we have, though, certain things that still require a great deal of consideration. For example, in dwelling units, how we could expand how through perception we can expand the interior of a building without actually having to make an enlarged space. There are many remarkable ways to consider this, through the way in which light enters space, the way air moves through, but also just the shaping of a space, the sequence, the position of units, and the awareness we have of the environment from these units. There is a way to really think about spatial elaboration within more constrained conditions, and that's something we need to do with housing, just to name one thing. And I think the interface between institutions and urban space, we clearly could explore much further. There are issues of security and the elaborations of the spaces in which the program is dedicated to security zones, which are under-articulated architecturally. These are questions that have to be dealt with at the architectural scale. They are not urban design problems per se. They go directly to social relationships at the scale of architecture. They're not landscape architecture by any means. Yes, environmental questions always are pressing on architecture, but finally, it is a social practice and a social reality that we build. Architecture is more deeply a social project than I think the landscape is. Urbanism, by virtue of it being something to do with planning, with organization, data, economics, policy, real estate, it's not as much a humanity, it's not an artistic project, and it's not a project about, to the extent architecture is, the social, believe it or not. The city, it comes about in ways that we don't think about in the way that cultural work works. Cultural projects like film and literature and painting work. I mean, architecture still has a long way to go in this world that we're in today. And I think we are a little bit in need, well, a lot. We need very much to pay much more attention to what are the problems of architecture. I think we're going to see a fading of particularly of the immature, or what should I say, early phase of computation. The environmental problem, we need to address it at our scale. I mean, I think we need to recognize that it's different at the scale of the building than at the scale of the city. I think the building can determine the city more so. For example, when you think of exhausting air from buildings, when you think of intake and exhaust, when you think of heat gain and loss, natural light, and all of these things, harvesting light, the difference between night and day. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that could have to do with how buildings are positioned in the city and in the environment that could help us think, if we work it out from within, of how it affects the environment. One thing I want to say that people don't think about enough is that we spend most of our lives inside of buildings. This is not something people pay enough attention to. Far more of our living is happening in the interior of buildings than in the city. And yet, so much of the work today in the schools is focused on urbanism, neglecting the deep interior space of the building. And I think there will come a time, it won't be long, I believe, I'm hoping, when this is recognized. I've been working on the interior for 20 years in our curriculum at Harvard, but I still think this is an emerging reality, that the dominant question of architecture will be the interior. And that goes from the environmental perspective all the way through to the social matters that I've spoken to, the issues of privacy and the kind of multiplication of different subjectivities, different people with different experiences of space given their social and familial structures. You know, the way the family is structured affects the development of space insides. So I'm very interested in all of that, and I hope that we see a widening of attention to it. I think the repertoire of the language of architecture is always expanding. This is something we've been working on for a long time. Geometry is a source of inventiveness and will continue to help us rethink the spaces of architecture.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And thank you for accepting our invitation to come to Guatemala and lecture and have this informal interview. And thank you.
Okay, I had a great time here. It was wonderful. Thank you.